talking about the Cousin Oliver syndrome next on another episode of Retro Serial. Stay tuned. So today on Retro Serial, we will be talking about the Cousin Oliver syndrome. We'll be talking about its origins and what it is and how that trope appeared in some of my favorite TV comedies growing up, and whether or not that trope was successful and useful or not successful and useful. We're going to leave that ultimately for you to decide. But before we get to that, I would like to encourage you to like this video, comment, and subscribe. These are small steps for you, but they would really mean a lot to me here on the channel. And if you're willing to donate to this channel, we will be leaving a link in our description box below to our Buy Me a Coffee page where you can donate some of that hard-earned cash. So if you're so inclined, it would mean a great deal to me. We are dedicated here to bringing you the best of retro memorabilia and nostalgia on Growing Up Generation X, and every little bit helps. So thank you for that. And now, let's talk about the Cousin Oliver syndrome. Let's start with the origin and definition of the Cousin Oliver syndrome. Cousin Oliver syndrome was named after the character Cousin Oliver, played by Robbie Reese, introduced into season 5 on The Brady Bunch. It was a trope to introduce a young kid in hopes to boost the ratings that were slowly declining on The Brady Bunch. So what they did was they introduced this young kid, Cousin Oliver, and all kind of antics ensued in hopes to raise their ratings once again. But unfortunately for the Brady Bunch, this trope just didn't work out. After Cousin Oliver appeared on the show, 5 short episodes later, the Brady Bunch was finally canceled. Now that we understand the origin and definition of the Cousin Oliver syndrome, I'm going to be talking about some of the television shows, particularly comedy television shows, that tried to use this trope to also boost their ratings or use this trope for various reasons. Now, what's going to follow is not in any particular order. It's not going from best to worst or worst to best or anything like that. These are just memorable things that I grew up watching television in Generation X and remembering this trope reoccurring on several of my favorite programs, and I'm sure you can remember this trope on several of your own favorite programs as well. Which ones were the best, which ones were the worst, which ones worked out, which ones didn't work out is going to be ultimately up to you to decide, and you can have that. First on our list is Different Strokes. Different Strokes introduced the Cousin Oliver trope in 1984 with the introduction of the character Sam Mckinney, played by Danny Cooksley. And again, forgive me if I'm butchering any of these names. Danny Cooksley played Sam Mckinney in Different Strokes from 1984 to 1986. The show ran for a couple more years after he was introduced, which causes me to wonder why he was introduced to the show. Was it simply to boost ratings? That could probably be it in one aspect. I really don't know what the ratings were at the time he was introduced. Maybe somebody out there knows better than I. However, I do know one thing, and that is that Gary Coleman, the actor, was tired of playing the cute and adorable and young kid. Because of his real-life illnesses that prevented him from growing, he was afraid he was always going to be pigeonholed as that kind of an actor. And I'm sure it was a relief to Gary Coleman when they brought in this younger kid and for his character arc to start developing into more adult themes, which we know that he wanted to do. Also, the character Arnold acted somewhat like a mentor to Sam in many of the episodes. So I think that maybe it wasn't necessarily a trope in order to boost ratings, although that might have fed into it. But I think more than likely what it was a chance for other characters to move on into more mature roles and for them to keep this lovable relationship between adults and young children going on this family show. What do you think? Next on our list is Family Ties. If you're a devotee to this program, you know that I absolutely adore Family Ties, but my adoration of the show is not necessarily why it's on this list. The reason it's on this list is they actually employed the Cousin Oliver trope. In 1986, we were introduced to Andy Keaton, who was played by Brian Bonsall. And I have to pause for a second and wonder why they introduced this character. You see, in 1986, the show didn't get over until 1989. That means they had at least 2 years, maybe even at least 3 years, maybe even 2.5 years of good character telling, of good storytelling, and the characters had a lot more stories to tell. Alex Keaton had more stories to tell. The parents had more stories to tell. Jennifer and Mallory had more stories to tell. So I don't know exactly why Brian was introduced to the program or why Andy Keaton was introduced to the program. The other thing is I don't think it was necessarily he was there to replace Jennifer, because Jennifer was actually already dealing with more mature subjects by the time Andy showed up on the scene. So I don't think it was like, well, we have to have these children themes with she's getting older with Jennifer and she's getting older, and so now we're going to have these children themes with Andy. She was already kind of dealing with preteen stuff by the time Andy got onto the program. So I don't know exactly what the reason was. Now let me say, after I say all that I did love Andy. I thought it was great. The only reason I could think of bringing him onto the program was not necessarily to boost ratings, because I don't think the ratings were down at the time, as far as I know. They still had 3 years, like I said, they still had 3 years left. But I think the reason he was brought onto the program is just he was an adorable character, and there was new plot developments that resulted in his character being on the show, and there was new connections, and it was very interesting to see the parents raising Andy and the relationship particularly he had with his older brother Alex P. Keaton, and how Alex P. Keaton was continually trying to influence him into his political ideas on the show, and his parents and the rest of the family continuing to try to undermine Alex in those attempts. So if he was introduced to the show because ratings were low, well, I would say that this trope worked out, because again, the show had another 3 seasons after Andy was introduced. So did this trope work? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Did you like it? Let me know. Next on our list is Growing Pains. Growing Pains actually employed the Cousin Oliver idea twice on the program. The first one was with Ashley Johnson, who played Chrissy Seaver, the youngest daughter, and she was introduced to the show in 1990. Like Family Ties, and I've talked about this before, how I kind of think Growing Pains imitates Family Ties to some degree, although I do think Growing Pains kind of became its own show. But over on Family Ties, you had a new kid and it was a boy. Well, on Growing Pains, you have a new kid and it's a girl. Was it an attempt to boost the ratings? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. She was introduced in 1990 and the show got over in 92. So if she was introduced to boost ratings and keep the show going for a little bit more, well, we'd have to say that it worked in part. However, the second one, as you know, is Leonardo Dicaprio, and he was introduced in the very last season. The show only lasted one more season after his character, Luke Brower, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, was introduced. Didn't last too long after that, unfortunately. The show was really on its way out. He was introduced for sure to try to boost ratings at a show that was dying and dying quickly. But the other reason he was introduced, and this is something that a lot of people might not know, is that Kirk Cameron was tired of playing kind of the cut up, kind of the underachiever, and he wanted to move his character arc a little past that. And so Leonardo's character was introduced so that he could be a mentor to that character. This was a result of Kirk Cameron's deep religious influence and him not wanting to be a bad example on film, but to be a good example. And so the Leonardo DiCaprio character was introduced so the Kirk Cameron character could in part mentor him. However, we'd have to say that this trope didn't work out at all. Unfortunately, I have to admit that I have not even seen one episode with Leonardo Dicaprio in it. Now, this is not to say I don't like Leonardo. I mean, he's a brilliant actor. He's done many things. But quite honestly, I was tired of Growing Pains by the time the last season rolled around. And I was a little annoyed at Growing Pains when they did introduce Ashley Johnson onto the program as Chrissy Seaver. So by the time Chrissy Seaver got there, I was just almost done watching the show altogether. Am I right in my evaluation? Am I wrong in my evaluation? Once again, I'll leave it for you to decide. Last but not least is The Cosby Show. We were introduced to Olivia Kendall, played by Raven-Symoné, in 1989. Now, with this Cousin Oliver trope introduced to The Cosby Show, I feel like this one was the most important out of all of them. And here's the reason why. Did it extend the life of The Cosby Show? Well, perhaps it did. In 1989, The Cosby Show didn't get canceled for another 3 years, which was in 1992. So we do have to say that with the introduction of this character, it played on for another 3 years. However, I don't know if The Cosby Show would have lasted without her. Now, that's up to speculation because obviously we don't live in a universe where that didn't happen. But let me explain what I'm thinking. Well, part of the draw of The Cosby Show, and this is leaving the personal life of Bill Cosby and what's transpired in his later years out of it altogether. But part of the draw of The Cosby Show was his interaction with young children. And that interaction with young children seemed to be genuine and seemed to be very sweet on screen, but it seemed to be disappearing as Rudy was getting older and going on to, again, more mature roles and more mature ideas as far as her character arc was concerned. And so part of that draw of The Cosby Show to keep it going was to see that genuinely sweet interaction with young children. And we got that with Olivia Kendall, again, played by Raven-Symoné. So in my opinion, I think this worked, and I think that maybe The Cosby Show would not have worked. I think the characters were a bit played out. I mean, quite honestly, what could Rudy really do, and what kind of characters could we focus on, or what kind of stories could we focus on that her older sisters didn't already go through? And so with the introduction of Raven-Symoné, it was a matter of reigniting what made The Cosby Show, in one sense, in one legitimate sense, so special. So am I right about these tropes? Am I wrong about these tropes? Once again, I'm going to leave it for you to decide and battle it out in the comments section below. Thanks for watching. This has been Retro Serial. I'm your host, Ian C. Before you go, please do me the honor of subscribing to my channel. It would mean a lot to me. Hit that like button, subscribe, hit the bell notification if you want to be notified when these shows are coming out. And if you're interested in donating some of that hard-earned cash, you can follow our link below with our Buy Me a Coffee page and donate some of that hard-earned cash to see improvements here. I'm always interested in improving this place, and improving it in every way possible to bring you the best of nostalgia regarding growing up Generation X. All right, we will see you again on another episode.